Big tech censorship revealed in the U.S. while American company Apple works in concert with the CCP to shut down dissent and demonstrations in China. Israel elects a new leader but is still unable to form the new government. What is behind these problems? A major fashion company engages children with sadomasochistic and bondage advertising. Belief in Jesus is falling precipitously amongst America's political leaders. The UN declares Nakba, or the Day of Catastrophe, towards the creation of the State of Israel. The nations have a new 10 Commandments, and it's not the ones Moses received on Mount Sinai. Events are escalating quickly. Find out how the world is moving directly into alignment with the Word of God in Headlines Meets Prophecy, December-November 2022. Hello, everybody. My name is Mark. You're watching and listening to the Russick Outlook. As always, let me begin with a hearty thank you for joining. Very much appreciate your time. Today's topic, Modern Headlines Meets Bible Prophecy, mid-November into December 2022. And as I explained last time, we're breaking it down this way in order to get our year-end summary review where I going to look at a number of patterns and what I believe are definitive prophetic signs that happened throughout the course of this past year that I'd like to encapsulate. So that's the reason we broke it down in these last couple of presentations this way. So before I begin, I'd ask if you wouldn't mind if you can hit the like and the subscribe button, whatever platform you're watching us on or listening to us on, podcast, Apple, Google, Spotify, all of the different platforms there, as well as Rumble. We're on Rumble, so I would love for you to join over there as well. I've mentioned before in the past, we're moving a lot of our video platforms over there because of some censorship issues that we ran into, but we'll continue to post on YouTube and others wherever we can. So that's really it. If you can hit that like and subscribe button, I very much appreciate it. I'm sorry. Little tongue-tied. And if you can go to the Russick Outlook, join our email list, we'll notify you of new events. So there's a lot to cover that's been going on. And so on that note, let me get into this because it's been a packful month or two, I should say. As I always do, I try to give you just an encapsulation of different images of some events that we're going to be covering. So if you're following me on video, I show you the map of Ukraine and Russia. No surprise there. We're going to touch base on what the developments of what's going on there. There's been significant developments in regard to Israel in the United Nations that we're going to hit on. And not all of these pictures are going to cover everything. The riots that are happening in China, some very interesting developments in the Netherlands, some very unfortunate, what I believe is child abuse issues that came to the forefront in America. And we're going to touch base on the climate conference that happened in Egypt in mid to late November. There's a lot of interesting developments there and some other information as well. So, as I said, we have a lot to cover. I want to start, as I usually do, looking at the nation of Israel, because so as Israel goes, so goes what the Bible laid out in prophecy. No surprise there, especially if you've been watching or listening and you're familiar with the scriptures. So I always like to begin and like to see what is happening on the ground in Israel, in the surrounding areas, and the relationships of the nations to Israel, because that's usually a good indicator as to where we are. So on that note, let's cut back to the United Nations. So this was very, very troubling. The United Nations denoted the establishment of Israel as a catastrophe. The world body commemorates the Nakba, which is what the Palestinians called catastrophe, which alludes to the founding of the Jewish state. They now want to be able to celebrate this or at least pronounce this day annually, that the state, and if you think about that, the nation of Israel, which has, it's on it's an established country in the United Nations and around the world, and we can point to all the wonderful attributes and contributions that the nation has given to our society, starting with the Bible, but I can go on to bringing it up to modern day. And they are saying that this establishment is a catastrophe. And I would note that it is the United Nations Charter that began when it was the League of Nations that helped establish this and gave this over. So it's really acquiescing to the pressure, and what I believe is the pressure that is brought on, that is rooted in evil. What other nation in the world would they tell you that your establishment and your creation is a catastrophe? So, nonetheless, that's what they're doing. A vote of 90 to 37 with 47 abstentions. The United Nations voted to hold this commemorative event in the honor of the 75th Nakba Day, using the Palestinian delineation of the establishment of the State of Israel. They plan on doing this on the 75th anniversary in May in 2023. It was established May 14th, 1948. So that was one troubling thing. Excuse me. The other was the UN. They decided that Israel must give up its nuclear weapons. Now, mind you, Israel has never established itself and said that it has nuclear weapons. I personally believe it does, and I think most people, especially the intelligence of the different nations would know this. And it's their prerogative because, so much of the world and their surrounding area hates them, starting with Iran, and Iran wanting to wipe them off the face of the map with potentially nuclear weapons. So they voted that they must discard their nuclear weapons. They singled out Israel while citing the risk of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. The resolution also made no mention of Iran. No mention of the establishment of Iran. We believe that Iran has the capability of 1 to 2 nuclear warheads today. We're going to touch on that a little bit. So, the hypocrisy is just blaring. It's astounding. It's in your face. The UN also voted to ask international court's opinion of legal status of Israel's occupation. Again, going back to that word, occupation. It's such incredible anti-Semitic bias that's happening in these nations, and even the nations that abstained. Me personally, it's my opinion, you're a coward. These nations that abstained, at least, say yay or nay. But to do that, again, you're trying to play the middle of the road. I did want to cite a NGO based out of Hague that came against the European Union in regard to the two-state solution. So, a little bit of good news, too. I wanted to cite this in regard to Israel. The report was published by the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, and it shows that the EU's vision of a two-state solution does not correspond with the body's regional interest or reality on the ground. And I give you, the breakdown of what it says in this report and encapsulation of it. But it's basically saying that, Europe's desire to do this and to push Israel into a two-state solution. And I would say this is, this pressure is coming from all around the world. I'm in America, and it's certainly coming from the 46th administration. So it's not just Europe, but Europe is putting an enormous amount of pressure on them, and especially in regards to boycotts. So this NGO basically stated that everything that you're trying to do has had the reverse cause and effect, that it's just caused more violence, more distrust, more confusion in the area and in the land. So I say good for them. It was, to me, it was just a little refreshing to see that. I'm going to switch over while still staying on Israel, as I alluded to in the past presentation. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been elected again. I believe it's his 5th. Well, this was the 5th election in 4 years. It might be his 4th term. I have to double check that. But at any rate, the challenge, and I'm going to get into that. Actually, let me cut to the slide here. So he received his mandate after being elected to form the government. Now, unlike America or maybe some other countries that are listening, Israel, and I guess really a lot of nations go this way, where they rely upon a number of parties, and I believe you've got 7 or 8 or 9 different parties. So they have to form a coalition over 160. Netanyahu got a committal of 64, possibly 65, but he's got to be able to form the government. And he, as of where I am today, December 11th, that government has yet to be formed. He had to ask the president for an extension, a 2-week extension. This is a very, very difficult process. So, all that to say, it's not done yet. So for people who were happy to see Netanyahu get into office again, it's not a done deal. I was certainly one of them, as an outsider looking in, and I cited in last month's report that the overwhelming push behind him, or the exit polling, revealed that they wanted him in office, particularly if they were going to be in a war or a battle for ownership of the land, and in Iran in particular. So he's got this government, and he's got a number of very conservative Jewish party members in there. So he's got to form the government. He's got to assign positions. And it's similar in the sense of the United States, where a lot of prominent positions are certified by congressional hearings or Senate votes, I'll say. But now he's getting a lot of pressure from America and other countries, particularly in the Middle East, countries that have been formed alliances with him in the Abraham Accords, because they're leery of these conservative, quote-unquote, Zionists in terms of their beliefs. They're wanting to get certain positions within the parliament. So let me show you what I mean here. If you're following me on video, it shows him meeting one of the religious heads, Bezalel Smotrich. I might be not doing justice to his name, and if he is, I apologize. But under pressure from the 46th administration, they don't want these far-right nominees in defense positions. They believe that potentially could cause some issues. So I guess what I'm getting at is Netanyahu is not only, trying to navigate troubled waters of his own country and his own people and parties in this, but he's also getting external pressures from America and other nations. I'm sure Europe, I know Bahrain was one of them, UAE, because they're concerned, about some of these positions. According to media reports, the message was relayed by the American ambassador, Tom Nides. The administration expressed concern over Smotrich and his far-right political partner, Itamar Ben-Gvir, a self-declared disciple of Rabbi Meir Kahan, whose political party was declared a terrorist organization. Again, I covered this in last month. So he is reportedly open to running the finance ministry, but right-wing activists want the defense portfolio to go to religious Zionism, particularly because of the governance of the West Bank, which includes the settlements of Judea and Samaria under Israeli military law. So I guess what I'm just trying to point out is it's a very, very difficult process, can get messy. Politics often does. And, I just think it's important to understand, at least as Americans, it's, the systems are different, much like our friends to the north in Canada and elsewhere in England and other parts of Europe. So I think it behooves one to really understand the pressures that they're dealing with. And I'm going to cover a little bit more of this. And particularly if you are a fan of Netanyahu, and I believe a lot of Christians are, particularly in this country, you want to be able to effectively pray for him and pray for the people around him, and that they would come with wisdom and be led by the Lord. that's ultimately what you want. So just tying into some other issues around Israel, cutting back to video here as we go through the headlines. 46 in America signed a special representative specifically for Palestinian affairs. This is the first position at the State Department that solely dealt with Palestinian affairs. So it's really giving a lot of credibility towards the two-state solution, at least the messaging coming from Washington. Just some minor notes here. Israeli drones to deliver medical supplies to hospitals. I think this is awesome. It just goes to the intelligence and the technology advancements. What a wonderful thing. Technology can at times be, a little bit concerning, especially when you think about artificial intelligence and, used the wrong way. But here, I particularly if you think about how a drone could get medical supplies to a rural area or just, areas that are maybe hindered by geographical issues or weather conditions or things like that. So that was wonderful. Israel reported a 400% increase in immigration from Russia in 2022. No doubt, I'm sure that a lot of the war and the battles that are going on the border there in Ukraine have a lot to do with it. But again, Russians continuing to come into Israel, Russian Jews. There's that policy where the Israeli government welcomes any natural Jewish person who wants to return to Israel. Then you have something called the N7. So this was held, I think this is their third meeting. It was held in the Negev earlier this year, I believe in May, where you have 7 nations. It is Israel, Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, and Jordan. They all have relations and treaties of sorts. And it's not always necessarily, this is part of the coalition really of the Abraham Accords, as well as Egypt and Jordan, which has relationships and peace agreements with Israel. But it's also, economic developments, tourisms. It is also sharing military intelligence and whatnot. They have common interests. And it's a wonderful thing, at least in terms of, being able to help one another. And particularly, 6 Arab nations recognizing Israel, recognizing the not only the establishment, which goes against what I laid out in the very beginning, what the United Nations is saying. They're saying that, Israel is not only has a right to exist, it's a very substantial and profitable and cherished partner, if you will. So they had this in Morocco. They met for 3 days in Rabat, and it's all designed to strengthen regional cooperation. So I just see that as a good sign. I wanted to point out something, and I hope to do a little bit of a study on this, because there's a number of Arab nations that are trying to forge peace with Israel, and it's again kind of flip the script, understand their point of or their reference, because it's not always cut and dry. They have so many pressures, particularly in a number of different Muslim areas where obviously Jews are not looked well upon. So I wanted to point out something here that has happened in Bahrain and elsewhere in Morocco, where you just saw this. The Israeli president Isaac Herzog, welcomed by the Bahraini king in Manama on December 4th, and let me point to the video on this. And he had to, or he decided to, I don't know if he had to, he decided to release some a press agreement, or I'm sorry, a press release to different Arab publications and media outlets in the area, just welcoming and applauding the nation of Bahrain, the royal court of Bahrain, the king, and the different administrators there, and whatnot. And I show you a picture of this in some of the different Arab publications. It's very, very difficult on both parties. It's very difficult for Israel to do this, and it's very difficult for some of these Middle East nations. So, my way of thinking about this is pray for these leaders, because they are courageous. For Bahrain and UAE, and to a very large degree, Saudi Arabia, even though they don't have those arrangements yet, there is some significant headway there. Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, Morocco. These are difficult times, and the reason I say this too, from a prophetic standpoint, there will be nations, when you get to Ezekiel 37 and 38 and 39, I should say, I'm sorry, there will be nations who will not engage in that war against Israel. And I believe some of these nations are right here. It mentions the dam, which is most of modern day Saudi Arabia, and possibly some of those other surrounding nations in the Gulf. So that's why I wanted to point that out. And, they're looked upon as reformers. So they're open to dialogue. They're open to bringing in different churches. For instance, in Morocco, the king over there welcomes, and he's fighting an Islamic battle in the sense of he's stressing education to his imams to welcome all religions. So if you're Jewish or you're Christian or possibly other religions, he is saying to these imams and to the Muslim leaders, we must teach tolerance to one another. We must teach that we are to work together in concert with one another for the greater peace. So even though they are not necessarily followers of Jesus Christ, I believe they, a lot of these people can be used and are being used by the Lord. And, I guess I just wanted to harp on this a little bit, to bring it out, to pray for these leaders. When you think about the nations, maybe look at a map, look at Middle East, look at Israel's neighbors, and to call them out, because these reformers are, they are very brave. They're King Hussein in Jordan, an enormous amount of pressure on him, and President Sisi in Egypt. And I'm not saying I agree with all of their policies or anything like that, but don't clump people into one group, I guess. Don't stereotype is really what I'm getting at. Some other headlines, some other interesting things. Lockheed Martin signs an agreement with Israel's Rafael to join the Iron Beam laser project. This is really important because I'm sure many people have heard the success of the Iron Dome and shooting down rockets as a defense system. Israeli technology is very close to being able to thwart incoming missiles via laser technology. And I think they've successfully tested some of this in the field already. So here you have an American military company working in conjunction with them. And obviously there's strong relations with some of our, American manufacturers as well as the Israelis. So that's, to me, is very interesting. Israeli firm NewMed Energy signed a gas deal with Morocco. We're just talking about Morocco and the importance of these good relations. We've talked about how there's all this natural energy and gas off the Mediterranean, off the coast of Israel. They now forming agreements. They're moving their energy into Jordan, Egypt. Egypt is starting to funnel that elsewhere across the Mediterranean to parts of Europe. Deals have been struck. So Israel is now in a very significant, and I believe a God-ordained position where they have all of this natural energy. And when energy is at a critical forefront and in the news every day with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, it's interesting how now Israel is blessed with all of this. I've been citing this, and I'm going to continue. I just happen to think there's interesting developments. I can't put my finger on it yet, but look for Azerbaijan. They've been establishing some relations with Israel. They have decided to open up an embassy in Tel Aviv. So that's pretty significant. It is the first Shiite majority to do so on the right. Has nothing at all to do with prophecy, but I am a baseball buff. I am a New York Yankee fan, born and raised. Don't hold it against me. But I was thrilled to see that major leaguers had visited Israel, what was termed a project to drive anti-Semitism out of the park. So you have some different major league players here. And, I saw some of the videos on this. And to see these kids light up in Israel and their faces, Nelson Cruz and Cesar Hernandez and Candelario, I applaud it. And my understanding is that these are Christian gentlemen from different parts of Latin America, and they recognize the importance as a Christian to have good relations with Israel and to stand with them in times because of all the anti-Semitism that's going on. All right, staying in the area, Egypt, and I mentioned how they had the climate conference, and they trying to join this in as a spiritual battle where they're engaging all these different churches and ministries of all different religions. So they met in Egypt near Mount Sinai, and they came out with these 10 principles of climate repentance. And I just, and this is just my opinion, I believe this is a slap in the face from the enemy towards the 10 Commandments. But here's what, they came out with the conclusion of this. We are stewards of this world. Creation manifests divinity. Everything in life is interconnected. Do not harm. Look after tomorrow. Rise above ego for our world. Change our inner climate. Repent and return. Every action matters. Use mind. Open heart. Some very, make you a little bit warm and fuzzy on some of the marketing slogans. But I think this is potentially leading to, and I hope to break this down further in maybe the next month or two, this potentially could be looking at what ultimately becomes the false religion during the times of the tribulation, because it's this whole interfaith movement. Where we are one God, Allah is God, and Jesus and all the different gods, and they're trying to forge it and get you a kumbaya moment, and that's blatantly false. And when I look at this, and I have to look at Romans 1:25, it says they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. And I think this is case in point. I think this is really what we're seeing. They're telling you to worship, Mother Earth, if you will, and they're engaging the religious community to do so. So something to keep an eye on. Sticking on climate, there's some very creepy things happening in Oxford. Oxfordshire City Council passed a climate lockdown trial, and it begins in 2024. So I'll show you this on video, and if you can capture it. But what they are going to do is they've established 6 different zones in this area, and you will not be able to drive into certain zones at so many times per month or annually or whatnot. In other words, they're going to zone this off, and this is quote unquote designed to keep emissions down, and they will not allow you to drive or pass into certain zones. Even if you have 2 cars in your family, you're still going to be treated as 1 car, and they'll be able to block you with electronic gates. So this is Big Brother coming down and saying you can only go so far and drive so far, and we will allot you X amount of miles per month. And this is really what's going on here. This is very, very Orwellian to me. So if you're interested in looking more at that, look up the Oxfordshire City Council. Remember, this is the bastion of education. This is Oxford, and to think of how far and how ludicrous that this is coming is a little bit alarming. Staying over in Europe, I'm going to go to the Netherlands now, where you're having you're having a lot of riots, or not. I shouldn't say riots, demonstrations is a better word. The farmers, they're closing down 3,000 farms, all for the sake of climate change. You have to remember that this is the 2nd largest exporter of agriculture in the world, next to the United States, and they're closing them down. And remember, I just look at the black horse, which is the horse of famine in Revelation. Could this be leading it to? They're taking control of the food. They're shutting this down. They're saying this is all for the sake of the climate, staying on climate. Again, what I think is a false religion. Iran, as we've talked about so much, where their battles with Israel, they pushed their nuclear facility to 60% capability of uranium enrichment. Nonetheless, the 46th administration is still eager for a nuclear deal, and that the agreement is not off the table. This is according to the U.S. Ambassador Tom Nides to Israel. And on December 11th, Saudi Foreign Minister said all bets are off if Iran gets the nuclear weapon. So, again, this is not just Iran versus Israel. Iran is at dire odds with Saudi Arabia. This is a Shiite-Sunni conflict. I believe if you look at the map, Iran is looking to move and take control over all the areas leading into Israel. If you think about if you go south of Iran into Syria, into Lebanon, straight into Israel, they're trying to work in concert with the Palestinians down in Gaza. So they're moving this way, and they're at odds with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, some of the Gulf coast. So if Iran gets the nuclear weapon, that potentially damages Saudi Arabia and the surrounding areas. So they're very concerned. So you could have a nuclear standoff, because really what Saudi Arabia is saying is we don't trust Iran, and if we need to take things into our own hands, we will. And then you go back to them being at odds with the 46th administration we've talked about earlier in the summer, and the debacle of the president visiting Saudi Arabia with his hand out and getting slapped. And now we know that Saudi Arabia has been striking deals with Russia, with China, because they don't view the United States as a viable, a legitimate partner that can be trusted. So, there's that to watch out for. World Cup is just about, we're into the semifinals where I speak right now. We just saw Morocco win yesterday, and France beating England. But some interesting things there that happened. That you see here, if you follow me on video, the Tunisian, they waved their Free Palestinian banner and at the World Cup, and there was a lot of anti-Israel sentiment there. And the other thing, too, is, I think 2 days ago there was an American reporter, I believe he had the gay pride button on. My understanding is he's not, but his brother is gay, so he was doing it in support of his brother. I shouldn't say he was killed, but it's as of this writing, they don't know how he died. And the belief, what's been reported, is it's very possible that he could have been killed because of it. And, the gentleman was on air the day before. He was in good shape, but he did report to his brother that he had received death threats. So I guess, the far left, and, for all their ranting and ravings, particularly in America, but when you see things like this, which would never happen in a lot of legitimate countries, in Israel for that matter, it's just astounding how they let certain things slide. I'll leave it at that. Switching gears over to the Far East and China. There's a lot happening in China right now and it ties to the lockdowns. So let me. They've locked up certain cities. They've fenced in certain areas. They won't allow people to leave. For what I am calling the Charlie, Oscar, Victor, Ingrid, Diane isolation and control. So if you take the first letter of each of those names, you'll know what I'm talking about. And these people are fighting for their freedom, and it's really gotten out of control. Not as out of control, but I mean it's growing. It's growing exponentially. There are riots. There are demonstrations in different parts of China. There are calls from the people to bring down Xi Jinping. I don't see that happening personally, but and I'm kind of tying this into the World Cup. What is interesting is the World Cup, they're not showing any masks or anything. The people are in there, pretty freely, and they're avoiding a lot of the lockdowns, and they're trying to block this footage and the news reports from getting into China because they don't want the Chinese people to see this, because it just adds to their frustrations. They have been censoring World Cup footage that shows the unmasked crowds in Qatar. The rest of the world has moved beyond this, but Xi Jinping and his government continue to pursue a zero Charlie Oscar Victor Ingrid Diane strategy. Now, the other alarming factor from an American technology is Apple. Apple, and I'll show you here what they have done because they've blocked off and they filtered, a large part of the internet. The people were communicating with the technology of AirDrop, and Apple stepped in on behest of the Chinese Communist Party, and they blocked through software downloads the ability for them to use AirDrop. So they weren't able to communicate, and they weren't able to get this information out. And Apple has a little bit of a habit of things like this. And I show you some other headlines where they removed an app that helped Hong Kong protesters track the police a couple of years ago. And they also banned political engravings on its devices in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, again, in acquiescence to the Chinese Communist Party. So, what's really troubling here is you've got an American company working in concert or cahoots with the Chinese Communist Party, and it's really motivated by money. It's motivated by finances because of all of the development of, so many of their factories are over there. They're able to, manufacture many of their phones and other devices and I'm sure, other boards and things like that. So, this is basically, it involves billions of dollars, but it just goes to the nefarious relationships that are established between corporations and governments. And, that's, to me, again, it's another sign of, I believe, how things will escalate leading up to the tribulation. Because now you have technology, you have big tech, you have large corporations, you have banks, you have financial institutions, you have media companies working in concert with governments. So they become hand in hand, arm in arm, and we'll touch a little bit more on that in a minute. There are also riots around the world in November and December. So obviously in China, they've been happening in Belgium, Netherlands, we talked about, in Germany, in Iran, again, because of the jihad and the woman who was killed there. I've talked about this in the past. This is still ongoing. And on that note, before I forget, I don't have that covered in here, and I just saw this the other day. Interesting developments. There's reports that the Iranian regime has been in touch with, and they've sent people into Venezuela in the event that they are concerned about an overthrow of their government, that the Venezuelans would take in the Iranians, maybe the Ayatollahs and some others, in the event that they had to leave. That's the report. So, I can't say that conclusively, but I found it interesting. And again, just evil working with evil. You have other riots have been happening we talked about the elections in Brazil and Kazakhstan, Syria, Ukraine. So there's unrest around the world, and it's alarming to me. It's very concerning. Belief in Jesus is waning, is falling. Political leadership, according to the Washington Stand, a publication of the Family Research Council, the number of unbelieving politicians has jumped enormously since 2016. Before that year, only 5 elected politicians in state and federal seats expressed no belief in God. After the most recent cycle, there are at least 70 humanist and atheist elected officials from more than 30 states. Jumping over across the pond to England, for the first time in modern history, Christians have become the minority population in the United Kingdom. A recent census found that fewer than half of the residents in England and Wales identify as Christian. This is, once one of the mainstays of Christianities, and again, unbelief is growing. Jumping back to Russia, a couple of more headlines in regard to Ukraine. Putin just said the other day, one more missile will trigger hundreds of warheads from his side. The NATO chief fears Ukraine war could become a wider conflict. At the same time, ties are deepening between Russia and Iran. Iran is supplying drones for the military in the Ukraine, and Turkey, who they now have talks with Russia to seek special discounts on gas imports. So, again, this goes back to energy. We talked about this earlier. I've talked about many times how it's interesting how Erdogan is kind of one of those in Turkey. They're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and because they're a member of NATO, but yet they're working very closely in ties with Russia. They now have newfound ties with Israel. They have ties with Iran. So they navigate a slippery slope, and I think what they're if I would look at it, and maybe Erdogan is hedging his bets that whoever's left standing is who he may join sides with, and he's on a power trip too. Also, some of his motivation is the economy in Turkey is really suffering, and I think his election is next year. So if he can get some economic relief from Russia in regards to energy, it could probably help his cause. So speaking of elections, we just had the close of the American elections. When I last reported, so many people, we still didn't know where the balance of powers were in Congress. That's become a little bit more clear now. Looks like the Democrats were 51 to 49. Then just 2 days ago, Kyrsten Sinema, the senator of Arizona, declared her independence, but she'll still caucus with the Democrats. The Republicans have gained the majority in the House. It did not become this red tsunami as many people had forecasted. A lot of people believe that could have been tied to the Roe v. Wade decision. And if that's the case, so be it, because my understanding is from recent reports, since this went down, over 10,000 babies were saved as a result of this, where I stand now in mid-December. So this law went through in June. If it's one, it's amazing. And so the number is 10,000. I'm not sure how they got that, but that was one of the reports that I saw. Then you had the release of the Twitter documents and talking about elections and and really this should be no surprise to anyone with a modicum of common sense that technology and these people were working in cahoots with the Democrats, and the censorship that's gone on in this country and the criminal activity is just. It's such a shame, considering what a great nation we are, and we still are, but the battles that we have to face. And, many voters on the left, they looked the other way. When I was growing up, liberals had a spine. And today they just, not all of them, but many of them just kind of march in line with, if I'm a D and I could say the same on the other side, if you're an R, you'll follow that rather than being people of principle. You saw that 45 had his platform removed, and liberals didn't think anything of it. Oh yeah, that should be, that's normal. So any engagement of opinions and ideas or dissent of ideas, it's just out the window. So it shows there that they worked hand in hand. People were blacklisted. Information was shut down. And what is interesting, and I saw that, and I have a Russick Outlook on Twitter, so if you're on Twitter, love to hook up with you there. But I saw something, one person who I greatly admire, a woman of courage and of strength, is Lara Logan. She's former reporter, CBS, and a bunch of different agencies. She's courageous, and she tells the truth. But she was just saying, what a breath of fresh air. I think one of her posts where I saw this morning or yesterday, that her posts are not being shut down, and people are engaging, and others were kind of chiming in saying, yeah, all of a sudden, they were able to post something and others are sharing it. And you didn't have that for years, and liberals were okay with that. And again, I go back to, it's just, they're phonies, and I can go on and on because it just, I have to get into something here, and I'm winding this down, but I found this incredibly troubling, and I really wanted to take a few moments to talk about this, because I believe it's one of the greatest travesties and one of the signs of the end times that we're seeing right before us. So Balenciaga is a fashion company. They posted some sadomasochistic ads with bondage with children. And I didn't want to show the faces here, but I'll show you some of the images of what they were doing. And if you break this down, there's dragons on there. There's childlike drawings of the devil. There's a book of an artist that is linked to blood, dismembered bodies, mentions of Satan, and it's very, very troubling. And the response has been, what I believe is kind of slow. They're now blaming the advertising company and the people who produced it. But I believe this is also a troubling sign of other things to come. We've talked about some of the, you're going after the children. And actually, I wanted to, if I can call something up, I wanted to cite something from Luke, and I believe it's elsewhere in the gospel, maybe in Matthew as well. And this is Jesus. It says, "It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble," meaning the children. And what we're seeing over this past year or two in Disney, which was one of the staples of American values and family and entertainment, and you can't even say boys and girls anymore in this place. And one of their executive was caught on video saying that one of their desires in some of their media distributions and productions is to queer American children. I cite here some other animations that they were putting out, some movies. Owl House, which is about how becoming a witch and just kind of glorifying becoming a witch. Little Demon, which was something about, I think kind of, I'm trying to remember the Mia Farrow movie from the late 60s, early 70s. But anyway, it's kind of based on that, and, Satan's Child. And it was shut down. I will say that it didn't get, my understanding is it didn't get into distribution, but it did get through production. My point here is, and they're facing the economic repercussions of this because people have fought against them. But my point is that this is growing into the culture, and they're going after the children. And you have to ask yourself, why? What is it about children? And this is, growing and growing. It's not in America, not only in America, it's around the world. If you go to some public libraries now, and they're having drag queens, and I saw something where kids 6, 7 years old encouraged to put dollar bills into some of these readers' underwear and whatnot. I mean, it's bizarre, and it's happening. And so, let me cut to this on the video. What is happening to our children? This generation of children right now is the most confused. They're spiritually empty. They're a damaged generation, the most damaged generation in modern times. There are more accounts today of mental illness. They're more likely to harm themselves or to commit suicide. They're the most confused generation as to what they are, whether they're male or female, and they're the most separated generation as far as from the ways of God. So I wanted to cite something of pagan civilizations and what that brought in with it. They were without God, and the children became endangered. And you can look at many, many examples of this throughout history. They're killed in the womb. They were killed at birth. We're seeing that in America today. They are offered up as sacrifices to the gods, used by adults as sex objects, as sex slaves. They're mutilated. We're seeing a lot of this in America. I'm citing America But this is happening elsewhere around the world. But I'm thinking about the southern border and children coming through there, and the women and the sex slaves, them being tortured as well, or going into the sexual slavery market. It's horrendous, and it's real, and it's happening right in front of us. So they are confusing them, they're altering them, they're indoctrinating children, they're sexualizing them, they're altering their bodies, they're pushing for sexual surgeries, medical procedures, anywhere from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. These are kids. Let them be kids. Then, where does this lead to? And you're seeing a lot of calls now for the normalization of pedophilia. I mean, I'm citing 3 headlines. This took me 30 seconds. I said recent headlines on pedophilia. Sex therapist calls for the normalization of pedophilia. Norway ethics professor calls for normalization of pedophilia. Democratic professor calls for pedophilia to be normalized. So, it's happening around us. And to me, is where is the church? And I've cited before that I think less than a third of the church is looking at world events and the world from a biblical lens, from a biblical point of view. And this is happening all around us. And I have to say, where is the church? I saw something recently who said if the Apostle Paul, were to look at the American church today and everything that's happening in America, he'd be writing them letters. And I'd have to agree. And I'm not citing one church or another or anything like that. I'm just making a broad brush statement that, we need to be engaging this and, what can be done. And rather than look at an example of what I could find from the church, I looked at what I saw in America over the past year and a half, where the parents, the mothers, the fathers, particularly most of the mothers, stood up for what was happening in the educational system. They got up, they got involved, they went to school board meetings, they ran for political office, they ran for school boards, they became teachers, they got in the fight, is what I'm saying. And I don't see the church getting in the fight. I don't, they fall a lot of times by politics, and they don't want to go into the area. It's happening all around us. We're to have an influence, and I'm not trying to bring this on to a bad note, but Jesus said the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. And he said it, so it's true. But I have to look at, I personally, I don't see a lot of the church talking about these things, and many of them could be, and, I know of some, that are. But I'm going to venture to say, I'll put a broad number out there. I'd be surprised if it was more than 1,000 churches that would be able to combat things like that. And I'm not just talking about prayer. I'm talking about people of action. So, if you think about all the different denominations and churches and cities throughout this country and elsewhere in other countries, same thing. People are happening the same. I look at the model of the mama bears, the papa bears, the people who said, you're not going to mess with my children. You're not going to mess with my people. And I wish pastors would take that same passion and say, you're not going to mess with my flock. You're not going to bleed my flock. I'll just leave it at that. And it's just troubling to me. And this is my opinion only. And I'm from New York, and it says, the expression is my opinion and a token will get you uptown. But I personally, I would like to see the church not only involved absolutely in prayer, coming together, but talking about these things, talking to the parents, talking to the children, how do parents engage the children, so that if these questions come up, the parents have a basis of conversation for them. It's not just the kid going, oh, Dad, or oh, Mom, you're always on me about this or that. That's all. So I've gone on and on, so I apologize. No, I don't apologize. But at any rate, that's kind of the state of where we're at. And I'll be doing one more presentation that I think is going to be pretty interesting. I'm going to identify some things that I see, some patterns and developments over the kind of a year in review. but as it lines up specifically with the Word of God and the warnings by Jesus himself. So on that note, I would just like to say thank you for your time as always. Questions, comments, prayer requests, happy to take them. Just email russickoutlook@gmail.com. And I just, again, want to just say thank you. You've been listening to the Russick Outlook. And remember, as always, just my opinion.